French President Emmanuel Macron has called on Ukraine's allies to not be, quote, cowards in providing support for the war against Russia.
We will do everything necessary so that Russia cannot win this war.
France is no longer arguing about how much support Ukraine deserves. It is arguing about how far Europe is willing to go to stop this war from coming back again. Behind closed doors, away from NATO banners and press cameras, French leaders are discussing something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Not weapons, not advisors, but thousands of European soldiers. And the reason this conversation is happening now has nothing to do with the front line today. It has everything to do with what Europe thinks happens after the fighting slows. France is not talking about sending weapons anymore. It is not talking about advisors rotating in and out. It is not talking about training missions quietly tucked behind the lines. France is talking about soldiers, not a symbolic presence meant to signal concern, but a force measured in thousands, discussed behind closed doors, away from cameras, away from press releases, and deliberately outside NATO branding. That detail matters because escalation by accident looks messy. Escalation by design looks quiet, and this is quiet. When European leaders stop talking about shipments and start talking about brigades, something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface of this war. Not on the battlefield, not in the headlines, but in how Europe is preparing for what comes next. And here's the key point. The most important part of this story is not whether those soldiers ever deploy. It is why France believes the discussion itself is now unavoidable. Because once you understand that, you understand what Europe thinks is coming next in Ukraine. And you understand why Russia's room to shape the end game is shrinking faster than it planned. French officials are discussing a force numbering in the thousands, with some reporting suggesting numbers approaching 10,000, but no deployment decision has been made. This story did not break through a podium announcement or a dramatic speech aimed at foreign audiences. It surfaced the way serious decisions usually do, through a private meeting. According to reporting from Les Echos, French President Emmanuel Macron discussed the possible deployment of roughly 10,000 soldiers to Ukraine as part of a future European security framework, not during a summit, not during a NATO session, but in a closed room with fellow party members. That detail is doing more work than it seems. Leaders do not test speculative ideas in private unless they have already moved past the question of whether something is imaginable and into the question of whether it is manageable. This was not a brainstorming session, it was a stress test. What Macron discussed was not a vague presence or an undefined mission. It was 2 brigades, a real military structure with command elements, logistics tails, and the kind of sustainment that only makes sense if you expect the force to stay. This was not about rotating a flag through Ukraine for symbolism. It was about permanence. And what followed makes that even clearer. Macron and France's Minister of the Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, reportedly agreed that Parliament must be brought into the discussion within weeks. That step alone changes the entire meaning of the conversation. You do not invite parliamentary debate unless you expect political cost. You do not accept that cost unless the alternative feels riskier. This is not how signaling works. This is how preparation works. France is not posturing toward Moscow here. It is preparing its own political system for commitments that may be hard to reverse once the window opens. And to understand why that window is opening now, you have to understand what this force is not meant to do. The moment people hear 10,000 soldiers, their imagination jumps straight to the front line. That assumption misses the point. This is not an invasion force. It is not an assault formation, and it is not meant to charge east or punch through Russian defenses. What France is exploring is far more restrained and far more destabilizing for Russia's long-term strategy. A deterrence force. A presence designed to exist after major combat slows. A force meant to lock in outcomes rather than create them. To freeze lines instead of pushing them. To make certain futures expensive rather than impossible. That distinction is everything. Wars like this rarely end with clean victories. They end with exhaustion, negotiation, and fragile pauses that collapse if no one is there to enforce them. Russia understands that dynamic better than most. It has exploited it repeatedly across its near abroad. Frozen conflicts are not accidents, they are tools. What's different now is that Europe is openly questioning whether it can afford to leave Ukraine inside that familiar gray zone again. because gray zones favor the actor willing to apply pressure indefinitely. And Europe is signaling that it may no longer accept that asymmetry. The force under discussion would likely be built around mechanized or light infantry formations, not heavy armored spearheads. That choice isn't about ambition, it's about realism. Tank fleets are limited, logistics are finite, and sustainability decides credibility. A force that cannot stay becomes a signal of weakness. A force designed to endure becomes a constraint. This would not be a force designed to defeat Russia on the battlefield. It would be a force designed to make familiar Russian tactics more expensive, from testing ceasefires to probing escalation to simply waiting for international attention to fade. From Moscow's perspective, that is far more threatening than another shipment of weapons, because deterrence does not need to fire to work. It only needs to be present. Another detail in this discussion is easy to miss but strategically decisive. This is not being framed as NATO. That omission is intentional. NATO comes with automatic escalation logic, Article 5 obligations, red lines that collapse political flexibility the moment they are crossed. Once NATO moves, everyone moves, whether they are ready or not. France is exploring something different, a European-led multinational force operating under security guarantees rather than alliance clauses, anchored by France and the United Kingdom, but not formally wrapped in NATO's escalation machinery. That distinction gives Europe something it has lacked for decades: control, presence without automatic war, deterrence without forcing Washington's hand, commitment without surrendering decision-making to American domestic politics. And right now, domestic politics matter. Europe is watching the United States carefully. Elections, congressional gridlock, shifting priorities, growing uncertainty over how predictable American leadership will remain over the next several years. France is not trying to replace the United States. It is trying to ensure against absence. Ukraine is the test case. If Europe cannot stabilize Ukraine without constant American direction, then Europe's entire security architecture remains fragile. And fragility is exactly what Russia has learned to exploit. This force would sit in the space between abandonment and escalation. That space has always existed. Europe simply avoided occupying it. Now it may not have a choice. What makes this discussion unusual isn't just the number of troops, it's the unit being discussed. Brigades are not symbolic formations. They are self-contained systems. They imply command authority, logistics depth, sustainment planning, and rules of engagement that assume time, not urgency. You do not casually debate brigades unless you are thinking about permanence. That is why Moscow pays attention to this language. Russia understands force structure. It understands the difference between advisors and formations designed to operate independently. When leaders move from talking about aid to talking about units, the conversation has crossed from support into architecture. And architecture, once built, reshapes everything around it. If this force ever deploys, it will not look dramatic. There will be no daily combat footage, no armored columns pushing forward, no heroic charge meant for headlines. Instead, it would do the quiet work that actually decides post-war outcomes. It would coordinate logistics and sustainment at scale, ensuring Ukrainian forces remain functional long after emergency aid cycles slow down. It would integrate training and reform not as a temporary assistance program, but as a permanent relationship. Airspace coordination would shift from emergency defense toward managed protection. That transition matters more than most people realize. Once civilian air traffic resumes, the war changes character. Once commercial insurance returns, the economy breathes. Once ports operate without constant disruption, state capacity stabilizes. Maritime security in the Black Sea would become a priority, not because it is symbolic, but because shipping lanes decide whether Ukraine remains economically viable. Demining operations are slow, technical, and unglamorous, but they determine whether reconstruction is theoretical or real. This is not about controlling villages, it is about controlling systems. And once Ukrainian forces operate alongside European units as partners rather than recipients, something irreversible happens. Ukraine stops being a temporary project. It becomes part of Europe's security ecosystem. That is the outcome Russia has spent years trying to prevent. From Moscow's perspective, this is an uncomfortable scenario, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is ambiguous. If NATO announced a formal deployment, Russia would know exactly how to respond. The rhetoric would spike, domestic mobilization narratives would intensify, and the conflict would snap into a familiar frame. But a European deterrence force exists in the gaps between those frames. It is not an invasion. It is not peacekeeping. It is not NATO expansion. It is something new. That makes it harder to attack politically and harder to counter strategically without revealing weakness. Russia's leverage depends on controlling pace, on convincing everyone else that time favors Moscow. That pressure will eventually force compromise. A force designed to stay undermines that logic. Endurance strategies only work when the other side believes exhaustion is inevitable. France is signaling that Europe may be prepared to absorb time instead of fearing it. And that changes calculations quietly but profoundly. Because once endurance is matched, pressure loses its edge. The timing of this discussion is not accidental. France is not reacting to a sudden Russian breakthrough. It is reacting to something far more subtle: stagnation. Ukraine is entering a phase where victory and defeat no longer look like dramatic battlefield shifts. They look like systems under strain, holding or failing one component at a time. Russia is still advancing, but slowly. Ukraine is still resisting, but at cost. Both sides are burning time, equipment, and manpower. And time is the most dangerous variable of all. Wars like this rarely end with a clean conclusion. They end with pauses, ceasefires, frozen lines, negotiations layered over unresolved realities. Europe knows what happens next because it has lived through it before. Frozen conflicts do not stay frozen. They metastasize, they reignite, they become leverage points for the next crisis. France is acting now because the most dangerous moment in a war is not when fighting is intense. It is when fighting slows. That is when outcomes are decided quietly, when security guarantees either exist or don't, when deterrence is either real or theoretical. France is not preparing for victory, it is preparing for the day after momentum runs out, and that day is closer than many want to admit. There is another reason this conversation is happening now, and it has less to do with Russia than with Europe itself. Wars expose dependencies, and this war has forced Europe to confront how much of its security still relies on decisions made elsewhere. France is not reacting to panic. It is reacting to uncertainty. Uncertainty about timelines, about guarantees, about whether waiting for clarity is itself becoming a strategic risk. The longer this war drags on, the more dangerous delay becomes. Not because Russia suddenly wins, but because unresolved wars invite future ones. This is the calculation quietly changing in European capitals. Not fear of escalation, but fear of repetition. That is what drives preparation. This conversation is not a promise. No deployment has been approved. No orders have been signed. No units are moving tomorrow. But the message has already landed. Europe is no longer planning around Ukraine's future. It is planning inside it. That shift matters more than any single brigade. Because once leaders begin debating parliamentary approval, command locations, and force composition, the conversation has crossed a threshold. At that point, the discussion stops being theoretical. It becomes political, costly, and difficult to reverse. And Russia cannot unhave this discussion. The mere fact that European leaders are talking about brigades instead of shipments tells Moscow something uncomfortable. That Europe is preparing for permanence, not escalation for its own sake, not confrontation for prestige, but presence. And presence is the one thing Russia has spent decades trying to prevent along its borders. Because missiles can be debated, sanctions can be adapted to, and setbacks can be reframed. Presence cannot. Once it exists, it changes everything that comes after. If you want to understand where this war is heading in 2026, the most revealing signals are no longer coming from the front line. They're coming from planning horizons. Russia's strategy still rests on a familiar assumption that Ukraine can be worn down faster than Europe can stay engaged. That patience in Paris, Berlin, and London will eventually thin out. That uncertainty will do the work Moscow no longer needs to rush. France is now challenging that assumption directly, not with a red line, not with a theatrical speech, with preparation that changes the shape of the after phase. A European deterrence force does not need to deploy tomorrow to matter today. It only needs to exist as a credible option in planning documents, parliamentary calendars, and military simulations. Once that happens, uncertainty starts working in the opposite direction. Ukraine's future stops being provisional. Russia's leverage stops being automatic. This is where the strategic balance quietly shifts. For most of this war, Moscow has benefited from ambiguity. Ambiguity about Western limits, ambiguity about timelines, ambiguity about what happens if the fighting slows but does not end. That ambiguity gave Russia room to probe, pause, escalate, and reset. A European force designed to stay compresses that space. It tells Russian planners that the after phase of the war is no longer undefined, that there may be a stabilizing presence ready to lock in outcomes before Moscow can reshape them. That waiting for attention to drift may no longer be a viable strategy. And in endurance conflict, that matters deeply. Because endurance only works if the other side believes exhaustion is inevitable. France is signaling that Europe is beginning to plan for durability instead of fatigue. That does not mean escalation accelerates tomorrow. It means leverage shifts now. In long wars, leverage is everything. France is not preparing to send 10,000 soldiers to fight Russia tomorrow. What it is doing is far more consequential. It is preparing for a moment most wars eventually reach, when the shooting slows but the outcome is still undecided. When ceasefires are discussed but not trusted. When pauses feel temporary and the next crisis is already forming beneath the surface. That is the moment Russia has relied on for decades. The moment when attention fades, when guarantees weaken, when pressure quietly resumes under a different name. France is signaling that Europe may no longer be willing to leave that moment unmanaged. This is not about winning the next battle. It is about shaping what comes after the last one. A European presence inside Ukraine would not erase risk. It would not magically resolve disputes. It would not guarantee peace, but it would remove isolation. Ukraine would no longer stand alone in the gray space between war and peace. It would no longer rely solely on promises that must be renewed every budget cycle or election year. It would be anchored structurally and visibly inside Europe's security architecture. And that changes everything that follows. Russia has shown it can adapt to sanctions, absorb losses, and reframe setbacks when it needs to. What it cannot easily undo is presence. Presence reshapes expectations. Presence reshapes planning. Presence reshapes what escalation even looks like. That is why this discussion matters, even if no boots ever cross the border. Because wars do not end when the firing stops. They end when someone shows up to make sure it does not start again. And for the first time since this war began, Europe is openly debating whether it will take responsibility for that role. That debate alone tells you where this conflict is heading, not toward a clean victory, not toward a frozen illusion, but toward a future where Ukraine is no longer waiting to see what others decide, and where Russia may finally be forced to accept that time is no longer working exclusively in its favor.